Today's video is in response to the last video. Let's take a look. In the last video about choosing an ASUS Thunderbolt 4 Z590 chipset motherboard. So in this video, we're going to cover three things. One, we're going to cover PCI Express lane allocation. Number two, we're going to talk about bifurcation on those two motherboards. And then number three, we're going to talk about RAID, which is kind of a separate issue, but it bounces. We'll get into it. And the fourth thing we're going to touch on is, okay, if you're looking at 5 things you're looking at for a motherboard, if you change any one of those 5 things, that flips that upside down. For example, a question comes up about, what about if I don't want Thunderbolt? Okay, Thunderbolt was number 1 on this, Thunderbolt 4. But you don't have to have Thunderbolt. If you don't want Thunderbolt, then I would even look at a different chipset, a different motherboard, and I'd go up on the food chain. But this again, number 1, Thunderbolt 4. Number 2, ASUS. Number 3, we're looking at a couple of ASUS Prime Z590 motherboards. And what we're going to do, because there's 5 pieces of documentation on these two motherboards. So we're going to look at 3 pieces of that information. One, the motherboard manuals. We'll look at both of them because we're going to look at PCI Express resources. Number 2, we're going to look in the BIOS manual, and we're going to take a look at how that plays out for bifurcation, which is a little bit wonky, but that's the way the vendor did it. All I am is the messenger. And I'll explain, and I think you'll understand as we extrapolate the information, as we go to step 3 about those that want to do RAID, how this plays out, where I said, and I'll restate it, do you want to put a quad adapter on here? And I said, no. And I said, do you want to do a dual adapter? And I said, no, you can't. But I'm going to explain the details of why you can, but I'm going to show you why you shouldn't. So let's look at the manuals. Okay, motherboard number 1, this is the Prime Z590P. And remember, to reiterate, we're looking at 2 of the least expensive Prime Z590 motherboards for Thunderbolt 4. And what we don't know, or one part of the quotient that we're not sure about, we know he's going to have a new motherboard because he had Thunderbolt 3, but we're not sure if the viewer, if that subscriber, is going to have a new CPU. So the first thing I want to do, I did a search on the document for PCI Express, and we're looking at expansion slots, and this is page 6. And what we're looking at for an 11th generation processor, PCI Express 4, for a 10th generation processor, PCI Express 3. With the 11th generation processor, 8 cores. With a 10th generation processor, 10 cores. And we've outlined and identified 4 levels of computer builds. Number 1, an entry-level machine, which would be 10 cores. We're talking about 8 now. Number 2, a secondary level, which would be 16 cores, which is not this, which could either now be on the Z690, we'll get to that in another video, and that's going to get more complicated than this is, or, as we talked about, on the AMD chipset with the ASUS ProArt B550, with the number 1 requirement being, I want something on AMD. Number 2, I want Thunderbolt 4. At the time, it was the ASUS ProArt B550. Now, if you want full use of Thunderbolt 4, we suggest use the add-in card. You have to go up on the food chain, different motherboard. But at the time, that originally was the only way to get Thunderbolt 4 on AMD, and it was built in. Now that card's available. And that's what we're going to be doing with these two motherboards because the add-in card is available. Second thing we need to look at. Okay, with the 11th generation processor, supports PCI Express 4x16 on 1 slot. We're going to go look at the motherboard layout and see what that looks like because we only have 1 slot. The second slot on the motherboard is, well, let's go look at the layout. Okay, motherboard layout on page 14. Okay, we have PCI Express x16_1 and PCI Express x16_2. PCI Express x16_1 is to the CPU, and M.2_1 is also to the CPU. As long as you're using PCI Express 4, you have those 2 resources. Okay, there's 16 lanes, there's 4, that makes 20. And PCI Express x16_2 mechanically is a 16-lane slot. However, electrically, it's a 4-lane slot. So while we're here, I'll address the question. If you don't want Thunderbolt, yes, you can put a GPU in PCI Express x16_2. Yes, it'll run on 4 lanes. And yes, that's the same thing you would have with your GPU if it were in a Thunderbolt external GPU. And both Thunderbolt 3 and both Thunderbolt 4 are PCI Express 3 and use 4 PCI Express lanes. But that's not the issue. That's not what we're dealing with. We're looking at these other 3 topics. Back over. I think clarity is key here. All right, first issue, PCI Express lanes, 20 lanes. If we put a quad card in here, I'm going to show you some more information because we're going to go look at bifurcation and see how that works out. Because even though you have 20 lanes, when you put a card on here, let's take a look at that of the manual. Now this BIOS manual is specific to ASUS for their prime and tough Intel 500 series motherboards. So we're going to do a search on the word bifurcation, and right here on page 40, show you what that looks like in the manual. Here's what we need to know. For that slot we were looking at, which is this slot right here, that's the only slot that can be bifurcated. Okay. Configuration options. Auto runs at a full PCI Express by 16, by 8x8, or PCI RAID mode. Now, by 8x8, I have no idea what kind of card you would use 8x8. But hold that thought, because it's going to get a little bit deeper. Right here, the third option, PCI Express RAID mode. Up to 3 SSDs installed on the Hyper M.2 by 16 card can be detected. That means when you're on that slot, you can only have 3 drives, and then you have the 1 drive here that gives you your 4. So you will not see 5 drives, even though you should. You're only going to see 4 drives, 3 on the card and 1, which is nuts, on the motherboard. However, let's go a little further. Now this manual is the RAID configuration guide that is even more generic than the BIOS manual. Okay, for Intel Rapid Storage Technology, RST, because this question always comes up. Can you have NVMe RAID? Yes. Can you have SATA RAID? Yes. Can you have both? Yes, but the two cannot be combined. NVMe RAID, SATA RAID. They have to be separate, but they can both exist. They can both coexist on the same machine. Okay. This manual also mentions a VROC chip. You don't have a VROC on this motherboard. And this speaks to the configuration specific for a Hyper M.2 by 16 card or PCI Express by 4 SSD card. They're all the same, but this speaks specifically to the ASUS Hyper M.2 by quad. Okay, let's go back now to the motherboard. All right, if you're going to do, and I'll come back because there's a lot of information here in play, and I will come back to the issue of RAID. If you want to RAID M.2_1, and then you got M.2_2 and M.2_3. All right, I would not RAID M.2_1 with 2 and 3. Why? Because 2 and 3 are PCI Express 3.0. This drive, M.2_1, is PCI Express 4. Just those 3 drives by themselves. If you don't add a quad card, only RAID those 2 drives. And I'll say with clarification, if you're going to do RAID on those 2 drives, as long as you're RAID 0, you're good to go. However, according to what they say about Intel, if you decide to do any of the other RAIDs on there, which require more disks, then they're going to have to be specific to Intel disks. Now, if anybody wants to go down that path, down that rabbit hole, be my guest, follow the instructions. I can tell you what it says, book and verse. I have only studied this and researched this according to the X299, but because that's so far back, I'm not going back to build one of those machines. Once we built the X399, that kind of cut that off. And once we went to the TRX40, that definitely sealed that. And now that the WRX80 is available, there's no way we're going back. However, we are going to be looking at another card that does 6 drives, and that's the Amphitech Squid because it has a PLX chip. So instead of leaping all the way back to an X299 workstation board with a PLX chip that provides the resources, we're going to look at that card. Now, as it relates to this, I hope you understand about yes, you can, but just because you can doesn't make it a good idea, and I don't recommend it. Let's go back. So number 1, PCI Express resource allocation. You've got 16 lanes to reiterate and 4 lanes here, but when you use that in bifurcation mode, you only use 3 drives, which is a real bummer because that's why we advocate if you're going to do this kind of stuff, you need to come up on the food chain. What do I mean? Well, for example, this is the Gigabyte TRX40 Designaire, where we have dedicated 2 16-lane slots and dedicated 2 8-lane slots. And we have dedicated 4 M.2 NVMe drives on the motherboard. 2 are straight to the CPU, and the other 2 are through the chipset, but they are all PCI Express 4. The only thing in here that's PCI Express 3 is this Titan Ridge Thunderbolt 3 add-in card from Gigabyte. And of course, I don't mention the GPU because that doesn't come with the motherboard. But the point of that being, dedicated resources. When you've got resources like this where things are shared, it's a give and take. And for those that want to talk about the X79, good luck to you. Separate conversation. I've seen maybe half a dozen people that talk about, yeah, I got a BIOS mod for that. Separate conversation, not relevant. But invariably when we talk about PCI Express resources, bifurcation, and RAID, that always comes up. So I hopefully have addressed it. We've got to move forward with technology. Now then, the next question. Can I put a dual adapter on there? hold that thought on the dual adapter because I got something I want to show you that'll bring this all together very succinctly, but I want to save it for last. Right now, let's go to the other motherboard and see how those resources play out. And of the two least expensive, this is motherboard number 2, Prime Z590M-Plus. Again, we are on page 6, and we look at, with an 11th generation processor, the resources play out the same. PCI Express 4.0, and with a 10th generation processor, PCI Express 3.0. And with PCI Express 4.0 by 16, that's by 16 mechanically and electrically. So theoretically, we should have, with PCI Express 4.0, with the 11th generation processor, that is 8 cores, 20 PCI Express lanes. Okay, on the chipset, or excuse me, through the chipset, one PCI Express 3.0 by 16 slot, mechanically. Electrically, it's 4X. And yes, you can put a GPU in that slot if you choose not to put a GPU in the top slot. It's about resources. And yes, of course, you got 2 PCI Express 3.0 by 1 slots. Okay, let's look at the layout. Now the motherboard layout, the other piece of information that I like that we don't have is the diagram. I love the diagram on the boards that show how everything is connected. And I understand why we're not getting that. It's kind of obfuscation. They do that because it's smoke and mirrors. They don't want you to extrapolate what we're doing and say, okay, here's what you got. It's like the emperor's got no clothes. That's the best way I can explain it. Let's look at the motherboard layout because I like to see physically where things are. I think it helps for the explanation. And again, PCI Express by 16_1 with one M.2_1 socket. And as long as those two resources are PCI Express 4, they both work. If, however, you use a PCI Express 3.0 CPU, you lose M.2_1. Really nice. And PCI Express with 16_2, even though, again to reiterate, same situation. Even though you've got a 16-lane slot mechanically, you've only got a 4-lane slot electrically. And that's where you put your Thunderbolt 4 card. And the Thunderbolt 4 add-in card goes through the PCH, which is the North Bridge and South Bridge, which is the chipset. That's a holdover. And then, of course, you have your PCI Express by 1_1 and PCI Express by 1_2. All three of those slots through the chipset. The resource we need to concern ourselves with is this one right here. And we're going to have the same issue on both of these motherboards. There's two things we need. We need 16 lanes on that one slot for 4 drives for one quad card. And we need that other drive, which is PCI Express 4 on M.2_1. So we could have 5 drives. But we only get 4 drives because only 3 are being seen on the card. Now, how this affects the quad card is also how it affects, I think, the dual adapter based on consecutive drives. That we're going to look at next because that's one piece of information that's not here that's kind of glaring that you need to know. It's come up before and I didn't understand it, and now I do because of the way these motherboards work. And that piece of information is ASUS, but one of our subscribers shared that with us a long time ago. And as ASUS has come out now with 3 different cards, ASUS shows how that works on these other chipsets because ASUS, number 1, has done the most of any of the manufacturers to make bifurcation a reality on more chipsets than just those that use dedicated resources for bifurcation. And bifurcation is the ability to take a 16-lane slot and divvy it up so that it's 4 by 4 by 4 by 4 because each M.2 NVMe drive requires 4 lanes. Whether you're PCI Express 3 or all the way through PCI Express 6, because another question came up, why do we keep using 4 lanes? For backwards compatibility. That's why. New drives are coming out, PCI Express 5, and they're working on the controllers. Phison has already talked about PCI Express 6, backwards compatibility. So this other piece of information, I want to show you how that consecutive drive layout works to only see 3 drives. It's a big deal why I said don't use a dual adapter because you're only going to see 1 drive if they're consecutive. Let's take a look. Now this is a document that's an FAQ, and ASUS ought to have this linked to all these other motherboards, but they don't. They regularly update this, and the title of the document, we'll have it in the description, Motherboard, Compatibility of PCI Express Bifurcation between Hyper M.2 series cards and add-on graphics cards. Now, all these add-in cards, as it relates to the ones we've tested, we looked at, ASUS has 3, we've looked at them. Gigabyte has 1 we've looked at. The new one's not out yet, which is 8 drives, another conversation, PLX chip. And then, of course, we looked at ASRock, and we're getting ready to take a look now at the 6-drive card, the Amphitech Squid. It's about how all this stuff carries out because bifurcation can be done one of 2 ways. This kind of bifurcation is bifurcation of the motherboard BIOS. If you have, and this is where this needs to be inserted because it's relevant, If you have a motherboard where you have 16 lanes on one slot, if you can bifurcate that one slot so you get 4 drives, great. However, if you've got that one slot that's 16 lanes and you bifurcate that but you're only seeing 3 drives, well, then you have an opportunity to leave that in the auto mode of 16 lanes and then get a self-bifurcated card that you can put 4 drives on, like this Amphitech Squid that takes 6 drives. It would work on this motherboard because it is self-bifurcated. It has a PLX chip, but it's PCI Express 3 because of that chip. So, you know, change one thing, changes everything. So let's see how this plays out. We're looking at, and I don't have to look up for the specific chipset, but what I want to scroll down and show you right here. Compatibility of PCI Express bifurcation between the Hyper M.2 cards and add-on graphics cards. Okay, the maximum M.2 SSD supported will vary depending on different CPUs. And even though it says an M.2 SSD, that is specifically technically an M.2 NVMe PCI Express SSD. These cards do not support M.2 SSDs, period. They only support, to reiterate, M.2 NVMe PCI Express SSDs. That's a big deal. Okay, restrictions. Talks about here on the Z590, Z490, Z390, and Z370. Only Intel SSDs can activate Intel RAID on CPU function in the Intel platform for the Intel rapid storage technology. And then the X299, that's what I had the most experience with because we have quite a few subscribers from back when those were current that built on that platform, so I know a lot about it. I just never got around to making a video about it because it's all about answering subscriber questions. By the way, this is BuildOrBuy. My name is Gil Boyd. Welcome. Now, more. And my understanding is as long as you RAID 0, you should be okay with any M.2 NVMe drive you want. However, this says only Intel SSDs can activate the Intel RAID on chip function. So you'll have to check that out. Someone will have to try it. I have no intention of building on this platform. All I can do is tell you what I read. Now this is what's crucial. Now I've said before that as we tried to use some of these quad cards on a dedicated slot where I have 16 lanes, I think there's a load balancing issue, and I still think that. However, as it relates to these chipsets, there's specifics on which slots you can use depending on whether you put in 1, 2, 3 drives. 4 drives is 4 drives. Let's take a look at this because remember, this is only going to support 3 drives, but it's not consecutive. 1 drive, 2 drives, and being consecutive M.2_1, M.2_2. And here's the kicker, and this relates, 3 M.2 SSDs are going to install only 3 SSDs on a slot that can read up to 4. That ought to be bolded and highlighted and double underlined. Up to 4. If the machine can read 4 drives, then you can install them consecutively. However, let's scroll on down. There's 4 right here. Follow the steps below to see if your machine on your motherboard can read only 3 M.2 SSDs on the model list. And that's the rub because that's what applies to these 2 motherboards because it can only see 3 drives. So how does that sequence work? 1 drive M.2_1. 2 drives M.2_1, M.2_3. You don't put 1 on the second slot. And if there's going to be 3, M.2_1, M.2_3, and M.2_4. You do not use M.2_2. Now you might ask, how does that relate to a dual adapter? Okay, if the drives being consecutive is the issue, the way this is drawn out based on a machine that only sees 3 drives, if you put in a dual adapter, and because they're 1 and 2, you won't see drive number 2. Now, my suggestion is test that. I haven't done it, but based on this, that's the way I think that plays out. So as I said to reiterate in the last video, would you put a quad adapter on here? I said no. This is why. Would you put a dual adapter on here? I also said no. This is why. You can, but it's just not a good use of resources. Our goal is number 1, keep it simple, make it work. And I can't believe what you guys put up with on Intel. Blows my mind. Now, if we went further down and did a research based on the motherboard, we pick up the Prime Z590P, Prime Z590M Plus. It talks about PCI Express with 16_1, and it shows only 3 drives. But the key to those 3 drives is here in the documentation if your machine can only see 3 drives and not 4. And I just don't think that's a good use of resources. So I hope that helps. That's the clarification. I can go more into it. To reiterate, I think we've covered lane allocations. Even though you've got 20 lanes, you're still only getting 16 lanes, which means you throw 4 lanes away. You can't afford to throw 4 lanes away. I would go up on the food chain for a chipset, TRX40, but that's where we're at. But if you persist in this, number 1, it's Thunderbolt 4. Number 2, it's ASUS. And number 3, those are the 2 least expensive. There's some give and take. Thunderbolt has been positioned on what we call the entry level and the secondary level for Thunderbolt 4. Thunderbolt 3 we can have on the 3rd high-end desktop, and on the 4th, the WRX80, but only on Gigabyte. So you have to make your choices and decide where you want to be and decide which resource is the most important, the most relevant, and what you can live with and what you can live without. RAID, I think for a lot of people, is more of a what if that I think I need it, because remember, as we talked about the Adobe After Effects multi-frame rendering CPU optimization formula, says nothing about storage. It's all about processing power, which is CPU and GPU. So if you got to build a machine and you can't get a video card, you can start with something like this. It's something you can grow to. You can add a GPU to later. Then once you have one GPU, then you can always migrate that GPU to a new machine, because you're going to have to start over with a new motherboard, a new processor. So do your what ifs before and not after the fact. I hope this helps. Questions are what we're all about. You guys are going to have some more. We're here to help. Now the next video I'm hoping is going to be the Amphitech Squid. Man, I've been trying to get to that for a long time. I originally was trying to do those in sequence. So on to the next video. We're out.